This is the lecture on chapter 6. This is part 1 of chapter 6. So title of the chapter is An Introduction to Macroeconomics. So far in this class, we have studied the foundations for economics, right? To learn the necessary concepts and definitions. And we will now use those to study macroeconomics, as we have already defined macroeconomics before for you in chapter 1. Macroeconomics studies the entire economy as a whole, right? Macroeconomics studies the structure and performance of the entire economy, and we invest in macroeconomics. We investigate the basic variables. These basic or indicator variables will tell us about the performance of the entire economy. And if the performance is unsatisfactory, then it will be up to the government to take policy actions to improve the performance of the economy. For example, if inflation rate is too high, if inflation is defined as the increase in the average price level, right? So we will tell you more about this in this chapter and the next couple of chapters. So if inflation is rate is high, then it means that average price level is increasing. That will hurt the consumers because it will reduce their purchasing power. When average price level increases, purchasing power of money will decrease. So which means that the same amount of money will then buy less than what it used to, and because of this, people will have less to consume. When people have less goods and services to consume, their welfare will go down, right? And as a result, we want to control inflation. And when their inflation is too high, we want the government to take monetary and fiscal policy to control inflation, right? So fiscal policy of the government is related with the revenue, with the income and the expenditure of the government. And monetary policy of the government is related with money supply and the interest rate, right? So we will talk about those things in more details later on. Now, so this is the introduction of macroeconomics. And now, so as we said, the performance and policy, right? So the first thing we want to tell you is about business cycle. This is a business cycle. Business cycle is the fact that sometimes the economy is growing at a satisfactory rate, but at other times it is not growing at a satisfactory rate. So when the economy is growing, GDP will be larger and larger as time goes by. But if GDP is not growing, if it is decreasing, then then GDP will be smaller and smaller as time goes by, right? So and when there is recession, so these are there are two phases of the business cycle. One is the expansion phase. When the economy is growing, size of GDP is getting larger and larger, GDP growth rate is positive. And the other cycle of business, other part of business cycle is recession. This is where GDP is decreasing, GDP growth rate is negative, and when there is recession, output will decrease, and then businesses will find it difficult to sell their product, so they will employ less worker. They may lay off workers, so unemployment will increase. Often in a recession, GDP will decrease, unemployment will increase, and this creates a problem. So whenever there is a recession, we expect the government to step in and use its fiscal policy and monetary policy to help solve the problem. And we will give you more example of this in relation to the Great Recession of 2007 and 2009. That is the biggest recession in the US since the Great Depression of 1929. Okay. Now, one thing we want to define here is real, and we will use later on, is real GDP, right? Real GDP will correct for price changes, right? Whenever there is inflation, you know that GDP is the GDP is, as we will show you in chapter 7, we will define GDP and show you how to calculate GDP. GDP is the market value of all goods and services. So how do we find out value of any good or service? We just simply take the price of the good and multiply with quantity of good. Price times quantity, that gives us value. But the thing is that that when GDP changes, GDP can change because of a change in price or because of a change in output, right? As a result, we now need to be careful because sometimes GDP can change even if output doesn't change. Only when price component changes, GDP can change. So we can show you here, this is suppose price P and then this is Y, output, right? So you see GDP can change even if output doesn't change. Even if output is stagnant, prices alone is changing, we can see a change in GDP. That the GDP that we calculate without adjusting for this price, without adjusting for this change in price, without adjusting for this inflation, we call nominal GDP. But on the other hand, real GDP, we will show you soon so with examples that this is what, this is price, but this is what, constant price. See? We hold prices fixed and then we see how output changes. And that is what real GDP tells us. So real GDP will reflect an increase in the production of goods and services after adjusting for price. On the other hand, nominal GDP will not adjust for that price. In nominal GDP, the price we use is not adjusted for inflation. So nominal GDP will show us just the nominal value of goods and services produced in the economy, right? And then the next thing that we have in when we consider performance of the economy is unemployment, right? So let me now define unemployment briefly for you. Later on, we will tell you much more about this. Chapter 7, Chapter 9. Unemployment is the situation when people are willing and able to work, but unable to find work. And these people, they are more than 16 years of age. They are actively looking for work, right? If there is a person who is less than 16 years, he will not be officially counted as unemployment. Or if there is a person who is more than 16 years, but he's not actively searching for employment, he will not be counted as unemployment officially. So unemployment here, we are saying that unemployment is another important measure of the performance of the economy, right? High rates of unemployment are undesirable because they indicate that a large portion of the workforce is not producing. So you see, there is loss of output to the entire economy when workers are unemployed, when not producing anything. And also unemployed workers, they suffer from loss of income, and sometimes that creates some other problems also. We will discuss later in details. Now inflation, increase in overall level of price, as we said. You see, this is price of one or two individual items may decrease, but overall, on an average, price of goods and services increases in an inflation. And on the other hand, let us just discuss, put the definition here, deflation. In a deflation, price will decrease, right? Overall price level will decrease. So high levels of high levels of inflation mean that it will cost the average family the same more to purchase the same goods and services. So see, they can buy less goods and services, and that reduces their standard of living, that reduces their welfare, and these people will not like. Whenever there is inflation, people will expect government to step in and try to solve the problem. Now, can governments promote economic growth? That is one question. Let us say that there is a recession and we believe that the government should come and try to solve the problem. But does the government have that ability? Will the economy move as the government want is to move? Or will the economy move in unexpected ways, change in unexpected ways? See, so macroeconomic models become helpful in this case. So macroeconomic models are used to clarify many important questions about the power and limits of government policy. See, what the government policy can do and what it cannot do, and sometimes there may be unintended side effects, right? So sometimes we say that some policy that will reduce inflation may also help end up creating unemployment, right? And vice versa. So we have to be careful about those unintended side effects also, right? The government should take corrective measures, prompt corrective measures if they see something like that. The answer to these questions are critical because countries experience vastly different economic results at different times, right? So government initiative will the same initiative may have different results at different point of time, and may have different results in different countries based on differences in the economies of those countries. So we use models to help us explain why large differences occur and how government policies can influence rates of growth, unemployment, and inflation. See, remember in chapter 1 we said that the task of economic model is what? Is to explain the current phenomena, explain the economic models need to explain what is happening now. It needs to explain how the system works, right? And then it needs to tell us, it needs to predict the future correctly, right? So sometimes some models may have limiting assumptions, but those models may be good in making predictions. So that those models become very important. So is monetary or fiscal policy more effective at mitigating recession? So see, what should suppose there is recession, what should the government do? Monetary policy, one thing the government can do in a recession is that what? Reduce the interest rate. Reduce interest rate, make investment, make invest borrowing very cheap for the private businesses, so the private businesses can borrow a lot of money, start new projects, right? Hire workers, train workers, start production. So whenever interest rate is the cost of borrowing money, right? And so interest rate also is therefore also is an important determinant of investment. Whenever interest rate is low, businesses will borrow more and invest more and create more income, employment, and output. And that may solve the recession problem. And then another thing the government can do, on the other hand, is in fiscal policy. Whenever there is fiscal policy, the government can what? Government can say that okay, because there is a recession, there is an environment of optimism. Private businesses, they are not investing in this pessimistic environment in a recession. Private businesses will not investing, so government can take large expenditure projects, right? Make roads and highways and buildings and other infrastructure projects. The government then start new project, hire worker, increase employment, increase output, increase income, and then this will stimulate the economy. When the government will start to spend, other private businesses will benefit, then they will start to invest, spend also. So there is a question, as we said, different situations, different problem call for different type of solutions. Is there a trade-off between inflation and unemployment? As we have already said, there is conflict between goals of different policies, right? So, for example, if there is inflation in the economy, the government can then try to control the inflation by increasing interest rate, right? Increase interest rate, make it difficult for businesses to borrow money and invest. Investment will decrease, and that will decrease demand, right? Demand for goods and services, and that will decrease inflation. This is what the argument says, as the conventional economic argument goes. But the thing is that if you increase interest rate to control inflation, then businesses will take less projects, right? And then that will reduce employment, output, and income. and may also result in what? Result in some layoff, so an increase in unemployment.